The Medici.
San Lorenzo and the Tombs of the Medici.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
And so the long story of the Medici closes, and closes where it began, in that venerable church of San Lorenzo, which they built and endowed, and which gathers in itself all the threads of their checkered history during the 343 years which lie between the tomb of Giovanni de' Bicci in the old sacristy and that of Anna Maria Ludovica in the crypt of the mausoleum behind the choir. In this church they were baptized as children, married as young men and girls, and buried when their lives came to an end, for family tradition required that they should all be laid at last in San Lorenzo. And here the black threads of tragedy and sorrow, the blue ones of love and happiness, and the golden ones of gratified ambition mingle and cross each other in the great tapestry of this family's long romance. Here in this church of San Lorenzo, soon after its rebuilding was finished, was seen the first great mourning of the family, when Cosimo's favourite son, Giovanni, died, soon followed by the funeral of Cosimo himself. Here 4 years later took place the splendid marriage of the young Lorenzo to Clarice Orsini, when the whole city gave itself up to feasting and delight. A few years later we have a far different scene in San Lorenzo. It is after the murder at high mass of the people's favourite, Giuliano, and the huge black catafalque surrounded with tall candles in the centre of the nave, the solemn music, and the weeping crowd attest a whole city's grief. Then come other scenes. The Medici are in exile, and every inch of standing space in the church is occupied by a deeply moved crowd listening to the great preacher Savonarola, who delivered some of his most impressive sermons from the carved black marble pulpit which stands in the north aisle. 4 years after the return of the Medici comes the funeral of Giuliano, Duc de Nemours, the first of the family to be buried in the new sacristy, then just added to the church. And this is followed 3 years later by the pompous funeral of his nephew, Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino. Then after Florence's struggle for liberty is over, and Alessandro has been installed as Duke, we have another imposing scene in San Lorenzo. It is the marriage of Alessandro to Margaret, daughter of Charles V, the last step in a scheme which had subjected the city to a tyrant's rule, and the crowd which looks on is a sullen and dispirited one. 6 months later we have again a burial in San Lorenzo, but it is a very different one from any which have preceded. In the dead of night, with as few lights as possible, in silence and secrecy, the murder being still unknown to the city, is hurriedly borne into San Lorenzo by a few hired servants the body of the detested Alessandro. The lid of the sarcophagus of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, in the new sacristy is forced open, the body unceremoniously placed therein, the sarcophagus again closed, and the small band of servants depart as secretly as they have come. This is followed 2 years afterwards by the marriage of Duke Cosimo to Eleonora di Toledo, in the presence of her father, the Viceroy of Naples, and a numerous retinue of Spanish nobles. 23 years later, San Lorenzo witnessed those 2 sad funerals when Cosimo buried within 1 month his wife Eleonora and his 2 sons Giovanni and Garzia. And then, after the Medici had become Grand Dukes, San Lorenzo saw a long succession of splendid marriages and pathetic funerals, beginning with the marriage of Cosimo's son, Francis, to the Archduchess Joanna, the sister of an emperor, and ending with the funeral of Anna Maria Ludovica, when San Lorenzo witnessed for the last time the burial of one of the House of Medici. The plain, severe style of the church, with its columns of grey pietra serena, the quiet stone, has an indescribably peaceful effect. In the old sacristy, at the end of the south transept, lie Giovanni de' Bicci, his wife Piccarda, and his 2 grandsons, Piero il Gozzoso and Giovanni. In front of the high altar of the church lies Cosimo Pater Patriae, and at the end of the north transept we have the new sacristy. That chamber of the dead, where the gigantic shapes of night and day, turned into stone, rest everlastingly. Rogers. Here, where so many of the House of Medici have at different times been interred, there still rest the remains of Lorenzo the Magnificent, his brother Giuliano, Lorenzo's son Giuliano, Duc de Nemours, Lorenzo's grandson Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, and Alessandro. Then comes a gap. Pietro, buried at Monte Cassino, Leo X and Clement VII, buried in Rome, and Catherine, buried in France, being absent. Lastly, in the mausoleum behind the choir lie Giovanni della Bandinera and his wife Maria, with the 32 remaining members of the family. In the case of the old and new sacristies, the sarcophagi contain the remains of those to whom they refer, but in the case of the mausoleum, all the tombs are in the crypt, the sarcophagi in the upper portion of the mausoleum being only intended as monuments. As the church of San Lorenzo stands on a height, and as the floor of the mausoleum is on a level with that of the church, it results that the crypt of the mausoleum is above ground, being on the ground level of the Piazza Madonna, from which there is now an entrance to the crypt. As originally built, there was no entrance from the Piazza Madonna, and the crypt could only be reached by the staircase leading down into it from the floor of the mausoleum. It was therefore a place which was easy to keep the coffins secure from all danger of depredation by thieves who might seek to plunder them of the jewels which they contained. And in this crypt, the coffins, standing in the places marked by respective tombstones, remained for about 100 years. But in 1791, the Austrian Grand Duke Ferdinand III decided to remove them from this situation. A mortuary chapel for the Austrian Grand Dukes had been constructed in part of the vault of the Church of San Lorenzo, and to reach it more conveniently, this Grand Duke made an entrance from the Piazza Madonna into the crypt of the Medici mausoleum, so as to reach, by passing through the latter, the mortuary chapel which lies beyond it. This throwing open of the crypt of the mausoleum made it necessary to remove the Medici coffins elsewhere. Beneath this upper crypt there is a lower, subterranean one, of exactly the same size and shape, and to this the Grand Duke Ferdinand III removed the Medici coffins. Either during this removal of the coffins to the lower crypt in 1791, or during the 60 years after it, owing to want of due guard over them after they were placed in the lower crypt, thieves obtained access to the coffins, plundering a number of them of their jewels and creating considerable disorder. In 1856, to remedy this state of things, it was decided to institute an official examination of the whole of the coffins, to open and examine each carefully, and to rearrange them in due order. Before this took place, the Pope, Pius IX, visited the mausoleum, and after holding a service in the crypt, gave his authority for this examination of the bodies, ordering it to be conducted with due reverence for the dead. This was then carried out by a commission appointed by the government in 1857. The coffins, to the number of 49, were in turn opened and examined, and the condition of the bodies, their dress, and ornaments were minutely detailed in an official report. The report showed, as will be seen by the details which have been given in the footnotes on the subject, that the bodies of all those who were cardinals had been left untouched by the thieves, but that all others had been robbed of most of their jewels. The examination being concluded, the coffins were again closed, and were arranged in the lower crypt in the same situations as they had occupied in the upper crypt, each being placed immediately under the tombstone in the upper crypt having reference to it. And this done, the entrance to the lower crypt, at the bottom of the flight of steps which leads down to it, was then walled up. Thus each tombstone in the upper crypt is over the coffin to which it refers. In the centre, buried in his black armour, lies Giovanni della Bandinera, with on his tombstone the words Cognomento Invictus, and by his side his wife, Maria Salviati. Around them, in the various bays and other parts of the crypt, lie their descendants of 6 generations. Anna Maria Ludovica, the last of them, rests near one of the centre pillars. Each of the first 4 Grand Dukes is interred in one of the bays, with his wife and 2 of his children. Similarly, in the upper part of the mausoleum, each monument stands over the spot in the crypt which holds the tomb of that Grand Duke. The 3 places of sepulture, the old sacristy at the end of the south transept, the new sacristy at the end of the north transept, and the mausoleum adjoining the choir, serve to mark the stages through which the Medici passed. We see them first as careful and assiduous men of business, prudent, generous of their wealth, and unflinching defenders of the poorer classes against tyranny. Then as far-sighted and capable statesmen, heavily burdened with public affairs, and steadily raising the power and prosperity of their country above all her former rivals, and at the same time spending both efforts and wealth on the advancement of learning and the encouragement of all forms of art. Lastly, we see them as crowned heads, ruling over a state which had been made by them the most important in Italy. And in each of these stages we see them, until their decay, incontestably superior to all their contemporaries similarly situated. Nor should the evils of one reign be allowed to occupy all the foreground of the picture to the exclusion of everything else. Many other Medici had governed Tuscany before Cosimo III, and a single bad reign should not be suffered to do more than balance a single good one. The evil effects of Cosimo III's reign have long since passed away. The lasting benefits to Tuscany brought about by Cosimo I, Ferdinand I, Cosimo II, and Ferdinand II, not to mention Cosimo Parte Patriae and Lorenzo the Magnificent, remain for all time. Lastly, they were as a family justly to be called great. Great in their extraordinary ability, great in their large-mindedness, great in their generosity of character, great in their unparalleled love for learning and art, great in their abounding energy, vitality, and many-sidedness, great, above all, in their peculiar gift for pouring oil on troubled waters and allaying fierce political passions which no others could pacify. Speaking of their attainments and the causes to which their success was due, Iriarte says, "The grasp of the varied capacity and the enterprising spirit of the Medici may be gathered from the specimens of their correspondence preserved in the archives of Florence. They are equally at home in the most contrasted topics, in war, in diplomacy, in domestic administration, in foreign policy, in literature, and in the fine arts. Their success was due in no small degree to the grandeur of conception, liberality, and nobility of mind that seemed natural to this family. Looked at as a whole, they stand out as worthy reflectors of the glory of Tuscany. The Medici, whatever else they may have been, were at all events thorough Florentines, and loved Florence with an ardour which none can surpass. When they became Grand Dukes, they did not, as might have been the case, rule from a distance, receiving the surplus revenue of the state, spending their wealth elsewhere, and interesting themselves but little in the welfare of Florence. Instead of this, they so thoroughly made themselves one with Florence that her history and theirs are bound up together. They gloried in her glory, they increased in it in countless ways, and they so completely identified themselves with all that does honour to Florence that it is herself she would most honour in honouring them. To obliterate their memory from Florence is impossible. Well chosen was their motto, Semper, which the earlier members of the family adopted. Wherever we turn in that city, reminiscences of them confront us. The Medici Palace, the home of their earlier days, still stands, solemn and grand, as when it was the hotel of the princes of the whole world, and memorable for much else besides. Castello speaks to us of Maria Salviati and her gallant soldier husband. The Piazza Santa Trinita, with its grave column of justice, the Ponte Vecchio with its strange passaggio, and the broad sweep of the Ponte Santa Trinita bring to our minds the iron-handed but capable ruler Cosimo I. The Boboli Gardens are eloquent of Eleonora di Toledo and her band of healthy children. The spacious Pitti Palace, the home of the family's later days, is still the royal residence of Tuscany, as when the beautiful Isabella danced and sang and led all social functions there. The great mausoleum reminds us of Ferdinand I and his prophetic speech. Poggio Imperiale and the pictures in the long gallery over the Arno recall Maria Maddalena with her accomplished sisters-in-law, Eleonora, Caterina, and Claudia, and her lively daughters, Maria Cristina, Margherita, and Anna. In the Uffizi and Pitti galleries we are surrounded by mementos of the three talented brothers, Ferdinand II, Giovanni Carlo, and Leopold. And everywhere in crowded museums and galleries we see pictures, statues, bronzes, gems, vases, inlaid tables, costly cabinets, and other objects of art innumerable, every one of which has been examined with interest and eventually purchased by some member of this family. As we stand in the magnificent mausoleum where their line comes to an end, and, surrounded by their great porphyry monuments, finished with the workmanship given to a costly gem, think of this family's long history, their gifts to their country and to Europe, and their last gift to Florence of so much that is precious to all the world, we realize something of what the Medici were and did, and feel they were indeed no ordinary people, and that their works were of the kind that survives the funeral fires, and endures when tombs and monuments have crumbled into dust.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.